Welcome everyone. I'm Anna Rose, the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Venda. We're really happy to welcome back Arch Getty for a lecture today called Soviet Anti-Semitisms. Our partner with this event is the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. I have a few notes about today's program. We'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for an audience Q&A. So please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during that time. We appreciate everyone's questions, but ask that you please keep them short and concise, only a sentence or two. And if you have comments that aren't necessarily questions or would like to discuss with others, we also have the chat function open. It's always nice to see where people are tuning in from, if you'd like to add what city you're joining from. And please make sure to switch the blue box in the chat from panelists to panelists and attendees so that everyone else can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, so afterwards you can share it with anyone who couldn't attend or go back and view it and our previous programs from our other virtual programming. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Tom Backer. He's a longtime board member and the chair of the Programs and Special Events Committee at the Venda. He's also an extraordinary ambassador who connects partners, including the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, who's long advocated on our behalf. He's also the donor behind the Venda's nonprofit Transformation Prize, which is given out every February.
Great. Thank you, Anna Rose. Good afternoon, all. This is the first event in what we hope will be an ongoing partnership between the Venda Museum and the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, or SURS. And Professor Getty, we welcome you today. He is also a member of the Venda's Council of Advisors, and as a historian of Soviet history, his work is really quite well aligned with our mission. So on behalf of all of us here at the Venda, I want to thank Professor Getty for joining us today. And I also want to acknowledge our Venda team, Anna Rose on screen, and lots of people who are not on screen who helped us to get this event together, and our partners at SURS for all of their work to get the program together for today. I want to also thank my friend, UCLA Professor Laurie, the past director of SURS, for putting me in touch with this organization and its valuable work. I'm also a UCLA alum, and I'm particularly delighted that we can bring together the university's campus and the museum's campus in this virtual space. Hopefully, as our partnership continues, we'll have the opportunity to do things together in the physical campus of both institutions. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce you next to the director of SURS, Dr. Laurie Hart.
Thank you so much, Tom. Welcome from the Center for European and Russian Studies at UCLA. I'm so delighted to be here today and especially excited to further our collaboration with the Venda Museum, whose remarkable exhibits and talks and films are such an amazing contribution to the cultural life of Los Angeles and to us at the university. It's my own favorite museum, and I hope that those of you who are here today and might be new to it will be able to see it in person before too long. I'm missing being able to visit. The combination of material, cultural, historical perspectives and attention to the real life, as well as the aftermaths of the Cold War, is incomparable. So welcome to everyone. I want to thank, of course, Tom Backer, Jos Siegel, Anna Rose Canzano, and Justin Jampol at the Venda, as well as Liana Grancia and Sanya Lachan at UCLA for making this talk happen. Of course, above all, I want to thank Professor Getty for being so generous as to speak today and on such a compelling subject. And I have to add that Arch Getty is not only a great intellectual force, as you will see, but writes the funniest and most delightful faculty profile page of anyone at UCLA. So do have a look at his webpage if you have a chance. So now let me turn the proceedings over to Jos.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurie. And I can promise you this is the last introduction before Arch starts. So on behalf of the Venda Museum, it's a great pleasure to partner again with the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, and especially with our very dear friends, Laurie Hart and Liana Grancia. Tom Backer, I want to thank you so much for bringing our institutions together and for always inspiring great programs. It's an equally great pleasure to welcome back Arch Getty to the Venda Museum Zoom webinar platform. And I intentionally say welcome back because Professor Getty was our guest only 4 weeks ago in the interview series Cold War Spaces, with a wonderful presentation on Soviet and Russian elections, past and present. You can check it out, or you can check out the recorded video on our website if you're interested. Art Getty is a distinguished research professor of history at UCLA. He specializes in the Stalin period and the history of the Soviet Communist Party. In his own words, his research seeks to understand how the greatest experiment of the 20th century, led by a movement that grew out of rational, enlightened, egalitarian, and democratic traditions, resulted in dictatorship and the death of millions of its own people. His books and articles have been published all over the world. Getty is a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a research fellow of the Russian State Humanities University in Moscow, and has been senior fellow of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University and the Davis Center at Harvard University. He was senior visiting scholar at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow and visiting scholar at the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales in Paris, and also a visiting professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where in fact I first met him when he was still working there at the history department. Professor Getty has written 7 books, his most recent being Practicing Stalinism, Bolsheviks, Boyars, and Persistence of Political Traditions. And today he will speak about continuities and discontinuities of anti-Semitism in Russian and Soviet history. Arch, I can't wait for you to start, and let me invite you to take the virtual floor.
Is it my turn now?
Yes, it is.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Between URSS and the Vende, I feel like it's home. Very comfortable place to be. I will today be talking, obviously, about Soviet anti-Semitisms. And the plural is on purpose. Let me just get the thing going here. Hope everybody can see that. Okay, before 1917, Russia was the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. I don't think there's any argument about that. There was brutal persecution of Jews, officially and unofficially. It was a land of the pogroms, spontaneous uprisings among peasants and Cossacks to kill the Jews in a given area, to beat them, to deprive them of their property, usually with official sanction. The government was as anti-Semitic as the bedrock black masses, as they were called. Jews were forced to live in particular areas and banned from living in other areas. This is the traditional anti-Semitism. On the right, by the way, you see some pictures of pogrom victims from the 1890s. This is traditional anti-Semitism. We all know what this is. This is a familiar kind of nastiness. It has analogs in other places and times. Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, the Arrow Cross, and other organizations in Eastern Europe. Hatred of Jews, unfortunately, is something that's been around for centuries. It's a cultural thing. It's a visceral thing. And it's unchanging. Over the centuries, from the beginning in the Middle Ages to the present, it's always stayed pretty much the same. It's around today, as we all know. It's around today in Russia. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a conversation with a Russian person, generally a new acquaintance, and the conversation starts out with, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, but, followed by a litany of complaints about Jews that fall into the standard stereotypes that we've all heard. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is not this, unfortunately, familiar garden variety anti-Semitism, but Soviet attitudes toward Jews, official attitudes toward Jews, which, as I'm going to argue, is much more complicated. It's so complicated, in fact, that you can't really call it classical anti-Semitism. Soviet policy ebbed and flowed in relation to Jews. It was not, as I'm going to argue, this kind of visceral hatred, and therefore is not really quite the same thing as the anti-Semitism that we've seen across centuries into the 21st century, even today. It was something different. And that difference, I think, is worth looking at. Let's look at it historically. Even before 1917, before the Russian Revolution, Jews were typically radicals. It's not hard to see why. If state and society were persecuting you, it's only natural that you would gravitate toward radical organizations dedicated to the overthrow of the system. Jews were common leaders in anarchist groups, social democratic Marxist groups, all kinds of revolutionary organizations. By 1922, as you see here, Jews comprised 5% of the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, or Bolsheviks for short. Only 1.8% of the total population. In other words, they were overrepresented, a statistician might say, in the party membership, in the Communist Party membership. Here you have the 1917 Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. Over here is Lenin, some familiar faces. Here is the young Stalin. Here is Lev Trotsky. This was the brain trust. This was the inside group of the early Soviet Communist Party. 4 of them were Jews. This led to all kinds of propaganda, a propaganda that was initially picked up in Germany and touted loudly by Hitler later on. The idea that communism, Russian communism, was a Jewish conspiracy. This is something that Hitler would push right up to the end of his life. And the sort of overrepresentation, if you will, of Jews in the Communist Party leadership leads to this perception. But it's worth noting here that this was essentially a myth, because very few of the Jews in the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, were observant, practicing Jews. Most of them were, in fact, atheists. Why do we call them Jews? Why did they call themselves Jews? Because in Russian culture and understanding, and especially in Soviet understanding, being Jewish was not a religion, it was an ethnicity. It was a nationality, like being a Ukrainian or an Armenian or a Russian. It was considered to be, therefore, one of the many nationalities of the Russian Empire. So these people were known as Jews, these 4, because of some kind of genetic perception, just like others were known as Ukrainians. My point here, though, is that the Soviet Communist Party in its earliest days was in no way anti-Semitic. In fact, they welcomed Jews into the leadership. They pursued the early Soviet government an anti-Semitic policy. Yiddish theaters, Yiddish music, books were published in Yiddish. Yiddish was taught in schools. There was a real kind of conscious attempt in the early communist regime to promote things Jewish, things Yiddish. Anti-Semitism was also part of the early Soviet propaganda world. Here you see a couple of posters from the 1920s. What is the anti-Semite? The anti-Semite is a beast. The anti-Semite is the class enemy. In the left-hand picture, you see anti-Semites on the right with faces like wild animals, killing, beheading Jews, and polite Russian society on the left, smelling the flowers and enjoying it. The idea here was that anti-Semitism is not progressive. Anti-Semitism is vicious. Anti-Semitism is built into Russian culture and is something that the Communist Party opposes. Now, in the 1930s, we know Stalin takes over the leadership of the Communist Party and ushers in the period that we call Stalinism. Now, one might think, given what we know and dislike about Stalin, that this would be the beginning of some kind of anti-Semitic persecution of Jews, period. It wasn't. Many of Stalin's right-hand men, you see a list of them here, were themselves Jewish by ethnicity, thought of themselves as Jews. People thought of them as Jews. The foreign minister, the president of the country, the head of the secret police. Jews were again, under Stalin, overrepresented in the government. Even more than that, many leading Stalinists, members of the government, were, if not Jews themselves, married to Jewish women, including Stalin's son and daughter. Therefore, into the 1930s, it's hard to pin the label of anti-Semitism on the Bolshevik government, at least at this point in time. Further evidence of this comes from the 1930s as Stalin takes over. The leadership of the secret police, the dreaded NKVD. Jews were 1.8% of the overall Soviet population, but notice how they are overrepresented in the leadership of the secret police. On the eve of the Stalinist Great Terror of 1937 and 38, a third, almost a half of the leadership of the secret police that will carry out the terror was Jewish. What was it about the secret police that attracted, from the very beginning of the Soviet period, Jewish participation? Well, there were a number of things. Some of it goes back to the old anti-Semitism before the revolution. If you were a Jew, a radical Jew, a communist, there was a certain amount of payback involved in your choice of where you wanted to work. If you were interested in payback against nasty Russians, you might tend to gravitate toward the secret police, which in turn welcomed you, because the secret police wanted people who were prepared to persecute back. Notice also here, though, that from roughly a third to a half of the leadership of the secret police, suddenly in 1939 it drops. It drops to 4%. Still double their weight in the population, but a dramatic decrease. Why? I always ask my students, what would happen? Why was this sudden in 1939? And frequently they know the answer to this. 1939 is when Stalin shifts gears and is looking for an alliance with Nazi Germany. This will result in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. Therefore, as a gesture to Hitler, as a gesture to his new Nazi negotiating partner, Stalin fires the Jewish foreign minister and dramatically decreases the weight of Jews in various leading organizations, including the secret police. Now, you might think that given this, that the terror of 1937, 38 into 1939, the Great Purges, as they were called, the Great Terror, might have hit Jews particularly hard. In fact, though, the opposite is true. But notice, first of all, the pattern that's taking shape here. 1917 to 1939, green light for Jews. They're useful, they're capable, they are radical. They have a kind of a high tide of participation in leading communist organizations. That now has suddenly changed for a couple of years here. Red light on Jews, because Stalin found them an embarrassment in negotiations with Hitler. Notice that also the representation in the Gulag camps. I was lucky enough to be part of the group, a multinational group, that got into the KGB archives for the first time in the 1990s, where there are detailed statistics about who was arrested, who ended up behind barbed wire in the dreaded Gulag concentration camps. The two sort of salmon-colored things here represent whether your ethnicity, nationality, was overrepresented, a plus, or an underrepresented, a minus, in the population of the Gulag prison camps. Notice here that Russians, great Russians, Slavs, are heavily overrepresented in the camps. The purge, therefore, the imprisonment part of the purge hit them particularly heavy. Same for Ukrainians, Belarusians. Jews, on the other hand, have a negative number, which is to say that as victims in the concentration camps, they are underrepresented, given their weight in the population. It can't be said, therefore, with any kind of accuracy, that the Great Purges of the Great Terror hit Jews particularly hard. It hit other groups a lot harder. We move now into World War II. Jews are active and leading participants in many parts of the Red Army fighting against the Nazis. 500,000 soldiers in the Red Army are Jewish. Many of them are killed. Many of them get medals. 150 of them become heroes of the Soviet Union. This right-hand picture are Jewish underground guerrilla fighters behind the Nazi lines, so-called partisans. Jews played an active and even heroic role behind the lines in sabotaging the German war effort. Jewish generals were glorified. They were celebrities. More than 100 of them reached the equivalent of what we would call 5-star generals. The stock, therefore, the Jewish stock, the approval rating shoots back up in World War II. Another sign of this new enhanced positive status for Jews in World War II was the formation of the so-called Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, a private organization, insofar as anything in the Soviet Union could be private. It was, of course, an official organization whose job it was to raise money around the world to support the Soviet war effort. They raised money in the United States, around Europe, insofar as they could. Wealthy Jews around the world were lobbied to contribute money to the Soviet defense effort against the Nazis. They publicized the plight of Jews under the Nazis. And most significantly, most radically here, for the first time in Stalinist history, this group had the right to travel abroad to America, to work with Americans, to be friends with Americans. This is, of course, a reflection of the Soviet-American alliance against Germany in World War II. But this was unprecedented. The government, the Stalinist government, was fostering, not only allowing, but fostering interaction with American capitalists. This group organized enough money to buy tanks, ambulances, and trucks. One of them, Simon Michels, who is on the right in this picture, very famous Soviet Yiddish screenwriter, playwright, and actor, plays a leading role here in making connections with Westerners, Jew to Jew across the lines. Here you have him conversing with Albert Einstein at a meeting in New York. Notice again here what's happening. 17 to 39, Jews are sky high in terms of their credibility. They go down during the brief interlude when Stalin and Hitler become friends. Now their stock is up again. They were anti-fascists when the Soviet government was encouraging anti-fascism. They were useful pawns, if you will, in the negotiations between Stalin and his Western allies. But then suddenly, bang, in 1947 and 1948, there's a dramatic reversal. Jews fall under heavy, heavy suspicion. Why? One of the triggers for this was the celebratory visit of Golda Meir to Moscow. Here you have her, you can see her in the crowd here, the young Golda Meir, first Israeli ambassador to the USSR. Now, in the beginning, the Soviet Union was a big supporter of Israel, one of the first to recognize Israel as a state. Golda Meir, therefore, arrives as the first ambassador, and it becomes a mega event, a media event, a massive PR event. She meets publicly with Molotov's wife, Molotov being Stalin's right-hand man, an activist on the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. She went to a synagogue in Moscow, in Stalinist Moscow, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Huge crowds turned out to see her. Now, what could have been a positive media event upset Stalin and his fellow leaders. Why? Because it seemed to be here, what seemed to be happening here was divided loyalties. Soviet Jews now potentially are also loyal to Israel. Can you be loyal to the Soviet Union, which they want, and loyal to Israel at the same time? This becomes a choice, this becomes an issue at this time, because the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States is beginning to heat up. The United States was becoming more and more a supporter of the new Israeli state, a backer of Israel, and therefore, as relations sour between the United States and the Soviet Union, Soviet Jews come under suspicion by Stalin. Who are they loyal to? Are they going to be loyal to Israel, to the new Zionist homeland, which does that make them loyal to the United States and therefore disloyal to the Russians, to the Soviets? Golda Meir's visit, therefore, triggers a new wave of negative Soviet official treatment toward Jews. And this negative Soviet treatment toward Jews, based on Cold War perceptions, based on international possibility of divided loyalties, is going to set the tone for Soviet policy toward Jews through the Khrushchev period, the Brezhnev period, right up to Gorbachev. 2 months after Golda Meir's visit, the Anti-Fascist Committee is closed down. Its members are arrested. They are charged with espionage. Molotov's wife, the wife of the prime minister, mind you, the wife of Stalin's right-hand man, is arrested and sent to camp, charged with espionage. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee is now officially called not a helper in the war, but an espionage organization, trying to pry Soviet Jews away from their proper Soviet loyalty. By the end of 1948, hundreds of them have been arrested. Solomon Michels, here on the left, whom we've already met as an activist who traveled back and forth on behalf of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, particularly famous for his portrayal of King Lear in the Yiddish theater in Moscow, is murdered on Stalin's order in a fake traffic accident. Anybody close to the committee is fired, arrested, lost benefits, can't get a job. And in 1952, there is one of the famous Stalinist show trials. 12 leaders of the Anti-Fascist Committee are put on trial and executed for espionage, a dramatic reversal from the status of Jews in World War II. They are now spies, Zionist spies on behalf of Israel, but really on behalf of the United States. In 1953 comes the latest wave of persecution of Jews, the so-called doctor's plot. 9 Kremlin doctors, the doctors who treated Stalin and the Politburo, are arrested. 6 of them are Jewish. They're accused of being spies engaged in medical murder, a Jewish medical murder plot against Stalin and the Politburo themselves at the behest of the United States. The official quote here: The Jewish doctors are accused of being a branch office of American intelligence, an international bourgeois nationalist espionage organization. The filthy face of the Zionist spy organization under the mask of charity is now revealed. And there's a media campaign that goes on here. Notice here this doctor who used to wear a mask of benevolent anti-fascist charity turns out to be underneath a Jewish spy terrorist out to murder Stalin. Those of you, by the way, who attended Anne Brobrov-Najal's wonderful presentation last week, her representation of Soviet and Russian politics as a pyramid with the colorful caricatures. I'm also going to represent it in a much less artistic way. The Soviet situation as a power pyramid. Stalin at the top sends orders down to the Politburo, senior leaders, let's say 24 guys, who send orders down to local party leaders, who send orders down to the rank and file, party rank and file, who then propagandize the Politburo's orders among grassroots citizens. Now, the message here with the Anti-Fascist Committee, the message with the doctor's plot coming out of the top, coming down from the top, is not explicitly anti-Semitic, it's anti-Zionist. An attempt is made to differentiate in the anti-Jewish campaign, differentiate between the loyal Soviet Jew and the disloyal, spy, murdering, saboteur, Zionist Jew. So officially, in the official documents, this is a campaign against Zionist Jews, not against non-Zionist Jews, and not against non-Jews. They still have a green light, but the red light, the target group officially, are Zionist Jews on behalf of foreigners. But this is the official message. And as is so often the case in Soviet politics, there are actual signals apart from the message, signals that accompany, unverbal signals that accompany the official orders that come down from above. When local party leaders, for example, get the orders from above, we're now against Zionists, they detect that the real subtext here is we're against Jews, even though that's not in the order. Even though that's not what the order says, people at all levels of the pyramid here detect what they think the bosses want. What they think is the real meaning. What is the signal being sent here? And the signal that is received down below is not only that Zionist Jews are a danger, but maybe all Jews together. So this becomes an anti-Semitic campaign, which started out as an anti-Zionist campaign. What's going on here? The Bolsheviks thought of the world in a particular kind of way, and here we're talking about Lenin and Stalin. The ends justify the means. Policy is about cold logic. Policy is utilitarian. Whatever helps us is good, we being the Communist Party. Whatever hurts us is bad, by definition. Whatever is good for us as the party is true, it's correct, it's something to be loyal to. You either are for us or against us, was party thinking. And that helps explain why their attitude toward Jews is not the visceral emotional hatred of the traditional anti-Semite. The Soviet attitude toward Jews, the Stalinist attitude toward Jews, and the Khrushchev and the Brezhnev attitude toward Jews is what attitude is going to be useful for us. We don't care about Jews one way or the other. We don't like them or dislike them. Some of them are in the government. But in framing our PR attitude about Jews, what's going to help us and what's going to hurt us? That's why we get this kind of utilitarian pendulum swinging back and forth in Soviet history. 1917 to 39, the original period, radical Jews, useful, good, green light for Jews. A hiatus here, when we're going to be nice to Hitler, Jews are bad, because that's the attitude that is useful to the party at that moment. 1941 to 48, got to win the war, got to cultivate Americans, American Jews, American money. What's good for the party, therefore, is being nice and supporting Jews. Now it's the Cold War. Now Jews are under suspicion for divided loyalties, for being possibly spies in behest of the United States. That's what's useful for the party now. So Jews get a red light. It's all about what's useful. And that's a different thing from universally and constantly hating Jews on an emotional level. Now, one of the interesting things that happens in this late 1940s thing is Stalin's lieutenants begin to resist him. The trial that eventually executes a dozen or so members of the anti-fascist committee, the judges at the trial complained that the evidence was fake. The leaders in the Politburo dragged their feet in even organizing the trial. Stalin came up with a plan at this time to deport Jews to Siberia by force. The rest of the Politburo, Khrushchev tells us, dragged their feet. Stalin said, "How's the deportation plan coming?" And they say, "Well, you know, we're kind of working on it. These things are complicated. Check back with us next month." Among leaders, therefore, lieutenants below Stalin, there's an attempt to slow down what is becoming an anti-Semitic campaign. And the best evidence for this is that 1 week after Stalin dies in 1953, and the lieutenants take over, the doctor's plot was said to be a hoax. It was undone. The doctors are released. The Politburo forced Stalin, mind you, to draft a letter saying that Soviet Jews were okay, Zionist Jews were not, to try to prevent this anti-Zionist campaign from becoming an anti-Semitic campaign. Stalin does draft the letter, but never publishes it. Stalin is interested here in inciting popular anti-Semitism below. The interesting thing here is that the Politburo fought him and tried to head it off. Here we have our signals coming down from above, signals that are being interpreted as against all Jews, the informal, nonverbal signals. The innovation here, the weird thing here, is the resistance back the other way from the Politburo, trying to head off, converting this into a mass campaign of anti-Semitism. Now, the persecution of Soviet Jews continues all the way to the end of the Soviet Union. And this is the part that some of us are old enough to remember ourselves. Discrimination, banned from being able to emigrate, thrown into prison, thrown into mental institutions if they protest. Many of the dissidents who were put on trial turn out to be Jewish. Once again, though, it carries the hallmarks of a utilitarian, a useful official policy. It is useful to the Soviet leadership, even after Stalin, to sort of hold Soviet Jews hostage, to use them as a bargaining chip with the United States. Give us good trade relations and we'll let some Jews go. Cynical view, Jews as commodities, Jews as capital, but per se, not the kind of gut-wrenching anti-Semitism of previous centuries. This is my favorite picture of Khrushchev. It symbolizes the Cold War. He is lecturing President Kennedy, trying to get better agricultural relations, and showing him a gesture that was frequently interpreted around the world as size matters. Many of us remember the persecution of Soviet Jews in the 1970s, the human rights campaigns, let the Jews go. But the Soviet Union doesn't let them go. In fact, the stronger the protest gets in the West, the fewer Jews are allowed to emigrate. The Soviet Union doesn't want to be seen as caving in to popular pressure. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, right? Restricting Soviet trade with the Soviet Union, turning American-Soviet trade in unfamiliar, unprofitable terms for the Soviets, results in a decline of Jewish immigration. Boycotting the Moscow Olympics in 1980 is followed by a decline in official Soviet immigration. The protest movement, therefore, doesn't really work in terms of freeing Soviet Jews, in terms of helping Soviet Jews. But it fits into our back and forth pendulum of what's useful to the Soviet government. Jews are now Cold War bargaining assets. Treat us nice and we'll let some go. Treat us bad and we won't let them go. We will be nasty to them, the Soviets are saying to the United States, in the proportion that you are nasty to us. They're assets to the Soviet government. Finally, Gorbachev lets them go as part of his glasnost policy. Now immigration, Soviet immigration, beginning with Gorbachev taking power, goes sky high. All the restrictions are off. It's Gorbachev making a kind of unilateral decision here that Jews are no longer pawns. Jews are no longer something we're going to bargain with the Americans with. And many of the Jews take the opportunity to leave, to come to the United States, to go to Israel. It eventually falls off in the 90s and after 2000. It falls off not because of any change in Gorbachev's policy, but because, more and more, all the Jews who wanted to leave are able to leave. My point here, though, is that the fate of Soviet Jews here is tied to the communist government's perception of how useful it is to treat them good or treat them bad. And the decision finally to let off all the controls and persecutions of Soviet Jews is an internal decision by Gorbachev, and is not something that's forced on them by Jimmy Carter or Jackson Vanik or Reagan. And this is our final chapter of the utilitarian swing back and forth on Soviet policy toward Jews. In conclusion, therefore, official motivations, how to treat Jews, are linked to USSR state goals. Those goals are to maintain a state dictatorship, maintain internal security, control populations, foster patriotism. That is the set of motivations that determines attitude toward Jews. Jews are rewarded or abused throughout the Soviet period according to how useful reward or abuse is to the Soviet government. Jews are not particularly singled out for abuse or reward as a real anti-Semitic policy would, because the Soviets do the same thing with other ethnic nationalities: Chechens, Ukrainians, Georgians, Poles, Crimeans. Official communist Politburo attitudes toward these other nationalities also follows pendulum trajectories about perceptions about what's useful to the party, what's not useful to the party, rather than any kind of inherent genetic biases. Soviet policy, therefore, does not fit the standard definition of anti-Semitism, which, as we've seen, is a visceral, unchanging, racist, racial hatred of Jews as a people. That's not what's going on here. Instead, Jews, like other nationalities, are treated as pawns, as assets, relations toward whom can be useful or not useful to the Soviet state. It's hard to decide, therefore, what was worse for the Jews, what would have been worse for the Jews in the Soviet Union. One Jewish fellow told me, a historian, that, standard anti-Semitism, we know how to deal with it. We've faced it for centuries. What was worse about the Soviet version, the utility version of treatment of Jews, was not knowing when the pendulum would swing back the other way, how to plan a life, given the unpredictable nature of Soviet policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arch, for a wonderfully fascinating and in many respects also surprising presentation, I would say. We still have 10 minutes left for the Q&A. So please, if you have questions, type them under the Q&A box, not the chat box, because that's where I'm looking. And we already have some. I'll start with Bruce Hollihan. Do you find a link between traditional anti-Semitism and the Christian identity movement in the USA today? Also, the American QAnon movement seems to derive much of its mythology from traditional blood libel accusations. What do you think about that?
I didn't hear the first part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so do you find a link between traditional anti-Semitism and the Christian identity movement in the USA today? And then a link to the American QAnon movement.
I don't think necessarily a direct link. In some cases there is. Many of the people in the QAnon and other kind of fringe conspiracy organizations are anti-Semites and peddle the same kind of trash that anti-Semites have forever. But I don't think that there is a complete identity overlap between the two. There are many, I think, fundamentalist Christians who are not anti-Semites. It's not a one-to-one identity. That said, though, many of the people who are the conspiracy theorists today happen to be anti-Semites or racists of various kinds.
Right. Next question is from Cecily Young. What was the role of Jewish anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union? And do you think Zionist movements today have a vested interest in labeling anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic?
Boy, that's another tricky question and a difficult question. There were in the Soviet Union, and there still are today in Russia, anti-Zionist Jews. In the Soviet period, they tended to be the sort of dyed-in-the-wool, dyed-in-the-red wool Communist Party members who followed the line, that Zionism was bad, Jewish was okay. They were, I suppose, well, it's hard to tell whether Zionists outnumbered anti-Zionists among Jews in the Soviet Union, because it's not something you wrote on a census form. It's not something that we really have any good information about at all. But I guess the answer to the question is yes, there were Jews in the Soviet Union who were anti-Zionist, but that tended to coincide with Communist Party membership.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Next question is by Geneva Rennell. Were synagogues allowed in the USSR during the periods of anti-Semitism in the 1970s and 1980s?
Yes, they were, on a limited basis. I mean, anybody who wanted to go to synagogue could. It might turn out to be a black mark against you at work if you were a religious believer or participant. I have a story about that, a kind of a funny story. A friend of mine, his father was an Eastern European diplomat in Moscow in the 1950s, during the worst part of it. He was Jewish, and as part of his gala official state visit to Moscow, his Soviet handlers asked him what he would really like to do for fun in Moscow. And this old man, because he had a wry sense of humor, said he would like to worship in a synagogue. Well, that caused huge consternation among his Communist Party handlers. We have to treat this guy nice. He's an honored guest, but oh my God, a synagogue, really? So they pile into a car and they drive to the only functioning at that time Soviet synagogue, go inside, but there's not 10 guys there, you know, the guys that you need to actually have a prayer service. But it's impossible to disappoint the honored guests. So the KGB fans out in the neighborhood and grabs the first 8 guys that they can find, slaps a yarmulke on their head, drags them into the church, and stages a prayer ceremony for their honored guest. But short answer, yes, there were synagogues in Moscow. I couldn't resist the story.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Kaylee Nathanson asks, in your opinion, how much did Israeli policy toward the Soviet Union in the 1950s contribute to state sanctions and anti-Semitism?
I think quite a bit. The Soviet Union quickly gravitates to the Arab side, as we know, in the Middle East conflict. The Americans gravitate to the Israeli side. And therefore, every conflict between Israel and her Arab neighbors immediately becomes a Soviet issue. It immediately becomes a diplomatic issue between Israel and the Soviet Union. There is anecdotal information that the Israeli Mossad was able to recruit agents in the Soviet Union pretty easily, but it's anecdotal. We don't have any hard evidence on that. What we do know is that the Soviet leadership during and after Stalin thought that the Israeli Mossad was organizing espionage inside the country.
Right. Wolf Gruner compliments you with a very interesting lecture and asked, did you publish on this? But he also asked, do you see similarities or differences with other former socialist countries?
That's not something that I'm particularly expert on. I've always been a Russianist. It does, however, spill over. We know, for example, that some of the East European Stalin era staged show trials of Eastern European communist elites have an anti-Semitic tone to them. I'm thinking of the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia, similar trials in Hungary, never made explicit, but you don't have to really make it explicit when you have a show trial of former communist leaders in Czechoslovakia and more than half of them have Jewish names. Again, it's a matter of signals.
Right. Next question is by Eric Gordon. In essence, is this really different from Soviet reactions to overt nationalism and chauvinism among other national and ethnic groups, such as Ukrainians, the Baltic countries, and Muslims in Central Asia?
Very good question. And I don't think, at least the point of my argument today, I don't think that it's materially different. It's different in scale, perhaps. It's different in timing, certainly. But the Soviet Union treats all the minority nationalities within the Soviet Union in the same useful or not useful kind of way. Okay, it's useful for us now in connection with a fight between Azeris and Armenians. It's useful for us now to promote the Armenian side. Yay, Armenians! Or in the Crimea. It's useful for us now to promote the anti-Crimean Tatar aspect. Yay, them. It's exactly the same, I think, in almost all of those. It's not characterized, again, I don't think Soviet policy before, during, or after Stalin was characterized by fundamental race love or hatred toward any particular group. I think it was always a matter of what's going to be useful for us.
Right, thank you. Next question is by Olga Sofer. Were the Jews the only nationality not permitted to leave the Soviet Union?
No, actually. Well, there was leaving the Soviet Union and there was emigrating from the Soviet Union. I'm assuming her question is about emigrating. No, immigration was very, very difficult for everybody. The fact that there was Israel, there was a Zionist homeland, there was a place to go to. The fact that this struck a responsive chord with the Jewish diaspora outside the Soviet Union, I think magnified it in terms of visibility, certainly. But nobody was really allowed to leave. Although, you know, there are always leaks in the Soviet system. There are always things that happen that don't seem planned. Once again, a sort of comic anecdote. I had some plumbers work on my house, and I realized, listening to them, that they were speaking Armenian. And they saw Russian stuff in my study, and they thought that was pretty funny. And I talked to them, and it turns out that they were Armenians who fled from Iran at the time of the Ayatollah to Soviet Armenia, thought that that was a loser, and then came to Los Angeles. Groups of them, whole groups of them. And I said, well, how do you do that? Armenians weren't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. You weren't allowed to immigrate. And he said, come on, we're Armenians. We can go anywhere.
Nice. Yeah. There's a remark from Anatoly Ulyanov, who writes, worth to mention that Stalin's policy and rhetoric towards Jews were also heavily affected by his relationships with his exiled rival Trotsky. If you look at the poster you showed us with the Jewish doctor revealed as a spy, his popped out mask face is a face of Trotsky.
Yes, absolutely. Trotsky had the misfortune to look like a caricature of what the Russian Jew looked like. Monocles, a big nose, a goatee, mustache kind of thing. It's a kind of a caricature version of a Russian intellectual twisted around to become a caricature of a Jew. There were a lot of people who looked like that. Kalinin, the figurehead president of the Soviet Union under Stalin, looked exactly like Trotsky. But the questioner here is absolutely right. That became a kind of standard image. Any Soviet person opening up a newspaper and seeing a character of that face knew that there was a Jewish message here.
Right. So it's almost 1 o'clock. We have time for one more question. And that is, what is Putin's policy toward Russian Jews today?
His policy is a kind of not really pay attention to them at all sort of policy. It's neither, you know, utilitarian, it's not anti-Semitic. He takes the line that Jews are like anybody else, and as long as they are loyal Russian citizens, don't really care one way or the other, which of course is what Jews had wanted all along anyway.
Right. Okay, Arch Getty, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I have to apologize for all those who wrote questions. There simply wasn't the time to cover and address all of them. Also, many thanks again to Tom Becker for his initiative to make this happen, and Laurie, Hart, and everyone from CERS to partner with us on this special presentation. Our next Wednesday program is next Wednesday, a Cold War Spaces interview about culinary space, debates and practices with Dutch cultural historian Jan Verriet, Wednesday at 12 o'clock. So I hope you enjoyed it and would love to see you again at our upcoming programs. Bye-bye.
Thank you.